How do generalized perceptions and stereotypes of female managers influence their opportunities and treatment in their workplace compared to the men counterparts? How did mandated appointment of women to boards in Norway reveal biases through impacts on stock price and company valuation? Why do investors exhibit less faith in companies led by female CEOs compared to males? And how can this bias based on the gender rather than qualifications be overcome?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third edition of our talks here on ESG reports. Today, I just wanted to have a little talk about ESG and kind of what ESG is. Here with my other talkers here, Jennifer and Ikyu. And so I know we've touched upon some of the other aspects, more intricate aspects of ESG in our previous talks about women and kind of focusing more on the governance. But today we kind of expand a little bit more outwards and kind of just give a broader view on what ESG is. So we kind of know that going forward. All right. So Iki, do you want to give us a little introduction about ESG and kind of what it entails?
Sure. So ESG is a acronym that stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's a set of criteria that investors use to evaluate a company's performance in these three areas. And currently, there's just like more and more socially conscious investors use this one to screen potential investments. And I think the reasoning behind it is pretty straightforward because they're trying to avoid holding companies engaged in risky and unethical practices, because companies that perform well on this ESG criteria are more likely to have a sustainable business model. For example, a company that has a low carbon footprint is less likely to be impacted by the future regulations on carbon emissions. And similarly, when companies that have a strong labor practice, that they would just like be less likely to face labor disputes or boycotts from consumers. So by investing in ESG, companies can just like reduce their long-term risk and increase their long-term profitability. And indeed, we've seen like the intense growth from like $12 trillion just like 2 years earlier in 2018, rise up to like around 17 trillion in assets chosen according to this ESG principles in 2020. But like practically, how does it really create values?
Yeah, so I mean, all this growth is great, but it's kind of useless if you kind of like if people don't really know how it creates value. So I think there's really four main ways that ESG can kind of like help investors and help companies. So the first is more directed towards companies. So when companies take on these ESG standards, it helps them tap into new markets, expand into other existing markets, right? So for example, you can see how in Long Beach, California, there was a public-private public works project where a for-profit company was selected by the government based on their sustainability record in the past, right? So essentially, we can see how this might not have been the case had this public works project been done like 50 years ago. The sustainability might not be as big of an issue, but it is today, which means that more and more companies need to start paying attention to like what they're doing with sustainability in order to maximize their profits. Because now it's not simply a case of like, oh, companies want to adopt ESG and push for sustainability simply because it's good for the environment. It actually can help them, in their own interests, right? We can see this in mining gold as well. This is kind of a more intra company impact. Like we see how studies have shown that like companies with higher social capital actually have less extensive planning and delays in their operations, which essentially allows for better use of resources. For something like mining gold, which is such a huge operation, this can really come into play. So we can just see how like it doesn't really matter what what industry you're in. Adopting sustainable values typically have really positive benefits for both yourself and the environment, right? And alongside that, we can see how sustainability also helps combat operation prices. So, for example, we can see there was a project by 3M that was called their 3Ps program, which stands for Pollution Prevention Pays. So essentially, it was a program directed at 3M's own companies' operations and trying to reduce the pollution that they create. So it included things like reformulating products, improving manufacturing processes, and redesigning equipment. All these things that are designed towards benefiting the environment and benefiting the ESG principles. We can see how they've saved over $2.2 billion ever since they started implementing this program, which really just kind of goes to show that like it just kind of furthers the previous point about like it's very similar to mining gold. It's just it helps the company improve their own processes, right? Another thing is that including ESG principles can actually help companies. They can have better strategic freedom, and they're not as worried about regulatory pressures, right? And this kind of depends on the industry. We can see very different levels of impacts on of regulatory pressures from the government on different industries. So, for example, you have industries like banking, which have over half, usually over 50-60% of their profit. It's at risk for state intervention if the company doesn't really doesn't operate in a certain under a certain criteria. And ESG is a criteria that can actually help reduce the amount of pressures that the state places on companies, right? So, for example, it stretches all the way from like pharmaceutical companies and healthcare from like 20 to 30%, which is still a vast majority, to like the automotive and aerospace industry, which have like 50 and over half of their profit at risk for state intervention, simply because these industries are so impactful to the U.S. majority, to the U.S. population, as well as everywhere else, right? So it all comes back to the idea that like ESG is really beneficial when it comes to whenever companies want to like have something to have a way to help themselves in a way that both helps the public and the environment. And then lastly, we have the fourth reason why ESG kind of really can help increase value, and that is by simply increasing investment returns by putting more capital towards opportunities that are more sustainable for the future, right? And this can kind of go to show this can kind of go both ways for investors and companies. For investors, it'll help investors, for example, in the stock market, which is arguably the most important avenue for investors. Investors can kind of use ESG to see which companies are going to be more pressured in the future, and therefore kind of place their investments in better areas. And then for companies, it can also help companies whenever they're doing like mergers or stuff like that. It helps them avoid stranded investments, which are just simply investments that may not pay off in the long term due to environmental concerns. And this can include things such as write-downs on the value of oil tankers for certain companies, like shipping companies, right? Because oil tankers in the future, as more and more sustainability pressures grow, the value of oil tankers are going to decrease, right? So this is just some kind of something that it's not really a point necessarily stated explicitly by companies that like, oh, we want to include ESG because it will enhance our investment returns, because we can kind of, like, for example, so if we're going to talk about oil tankers, if you're a shipping company is not going to say that like, oh, we want to increase ESG because it will help us increase our capital by, allocating capital towards better ships. So like that, it's just going to be something that I do. And I guess for most of these, most of the values that ESG brings, it's a lot more unconscious and subconscious that occurs, but still has an immense amount of impact. So I guess we can have Jennifer here talk a little bit more about, I know I touched on it a little bit, but I just want to let Jennifer talk about a little bit more on the impact that ESG actually has on like individual investors themselves, stuff like that. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, further implications for investors and companies, like Ethan said, it expands to just beyond, like in a number or I guess profitability, because investors can align their investments with their values and contribute to a more sustainable future for, the planet or like the company. And then for companies, investing in ESG can lead to, increased brand reputation and more like customer loyalty. And then regarding this area, there's been some studies, especially in country-based studies, that have yielded negative or mixed results. As in there are sometimes a negative relationship between ESG performance and firm value. For example, in a study done in the UK, low social scores perform better. And also there's been patterns where emerging markets also have a negative relationship. But I guess this is the overview of ESG and like how it can potentially impact companies.
Okay, yeah. So thanks everyone for coming to our third talk. It's been a good time, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
A diverse and inclusive board is a moral imperative for companies seeking to operate ethically and contribute wider social goods. Research that clarifies the relationship between women board directors and ESG outcomes provides an evidentiary foundation for pursuing policies of non-discrimination, equal representation, and unlocking the full potential of female leaders. Beyond fiscal performance, understanding how women's perspectives strengthen environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and governance accountabilities allows organizations to live up to ethical ideals of sustainability, community impact, and integrity. Promoting research that gives insight into the multifaceted value of diversity is itself an act of ethical leadership. With openness, humility, and care, we can elevate facts over biases and shape corporate cultures where all people are empowered to thrive and direct organizations toward good. This is at the heart of both ethical business and the conscientious pursuit of knowledge.